Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consul, your host. Before we begin this episode, I want to alert you that my latest book is now available in both print and ebook formats. The title is Love American Style, and it is a collection of short stories about men, women, their passions, and their dysfunctions. There's a short link in the episode notes that will take you to my Amazon profile page, where all 4 of my books are listed, 3 novels in this new short story collection. Again, the title of the new one is Love American Style, named after the TV series that ran from 1969 until 1974. Now, on with our program. Back in the year 2010, I was reading the New York Times Book Review, and it brought to my attention a book called Invisible by an author named Paul Auster, who I had never heard of before, even though Paul Auster was quite famous. He was new to me. The review on Invisible sounded pretty fascinating. I got myself a copy of the book, and I was captured right from the start of that book. And since that date, since 2010, and reading Invisible, which was his latest novel at the time, I have consumed a vast amount of Paul Auster's mini books. And he, is known for his imagination. His writing is extremely accessible. And I became a big fan of his, so much so that I wanted to have him on this podcast. And a few years ago, I started talking to one of his people about having Paul come on the program. And unfortunately, what I found out was that Paul was battling cancer at the time, but he was expected to recover. And his person told me, check back with me in, 6 months. And over the course of, a few years, I kept checking back with her. How's Paul doing? Thanks for asking. He's doing fine, but he's still fighting. He's not taking any interviews at this time. So this went on again for a few years, and then unfortunately, Paul Auster finally succumbed to cancer and died, and that was the end of my opportunity to bring him on the program and the end of the life of a great novelist. So I did the next best thing, as I've done with a few other authors who have left the mortal stage. I went to a person who could talk about that novelist. And that's what we're going to do with this episode. So in the spotlight is the late, great novelist Paul Auster and one of his friends and co-conspirators, biographers, I.B. Siegumfeldt, who spent 3 years logging conversations between herself and Paul Auster, compiling those conversations into a book titled A Life in Words. In the book, I.B. Siegumfeldt, who goes by Gita, and that's how I will address her during this episode. She documents 3 years of conversations that transpired between herself and Paul, starting in 2011. All 21 of Paul Auster's narrative works at that time, anyway, he had 21 leading up to its publication. All 21 at the time, they were covered in the book, or have been covered in the book, as well as all of the themes and obsessions that drove the work in the man. In total, though, Paul Auster wrote more than 30 books, some translated into more than 40 languages, as well as a selection of films that he wrote. I think he directed at least one that I just watched, The Inner Life of Martin Frost, which was quite imaginative, just like his novels are. I got familiar with him, again, after I read that review about Invisible, and became a big fan of his. Almost all of Paul Auster's works I have listened to in audio, and there's a great number of them that Paul reads himself. And Paul Auster is not the kind of guy who you would say is a great reader, but there's something about listening to Paul Auster's voice, very pleasing voice, and something about listening to Paul read his own writing, and that really captivated me. And it was just a great way to spend time listening to him telling his stories. So his good friend Gita is an associate professor of contemporary Anglophone literature at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. She is the head of the Paul Auster Research Library and the Paul Auster Society. She joins us now, not from Copenhagen, but from the coast of the Baltic Sea. She's taken a little time off for a little
time away to do some focused work. Gita, welcome to Novelist Spotlight.
Thank you. Thank you.
What a rare honor to be Paul Auster's friend and to spend 5 years. I think it was 5 years altogether. You were working with him on a book about his novels, the one I mentioned, A Life in Words. How did that engagement in the book A Life in Words come about? How did you and Paul first meet, and how did the two of you decide to do this?
Well, we first met in Copenhagen. He and Siri Hustved, his wife, were visiting Copenhagen for some a book fair, and he came out. I'd asked if he could come out and talk to me at the university, which he kindly did, and we really sort of hit it off. And he told me that day that he felt a little misunderstood in certain ways about his writing as a postmodern writer and all that. He didn't quite like that. And so I thought, maybe there's, maybe I should ask him if he and I could do something together. And so I wrote to him and said, look, I'd like to come over and talk to you. I'd like to do a biography, not of you, the author, but of the body of your writing. And miraculously, he agreed and felt that it was time for him to talk because Paul's always been, quite reticent when it comes. He gives a lot of interviews, but they don't really. I mean, they tend to sort of scratch the surface rather than go into in-depth discussion or conversation. So we started doing that, and the book, A Life in Words, took form as we were working on it, and we started in the end of 2011, and the book was published initially in Danish. We did it in English, of course, but it came out in translation, Danish translation first, and that was in 2016. So we spent quite some time on it. Of course, we did other things as well, but it was a lot of fun, a lot of work too, and working with Auster was quite an experience for me.
Were you doing this in person? Was it by telephone, by Zoom, or a combination of all of them?
I would go over and spend 3, 4, 5, 6 days. I would go over a couple of times a year, and we would talk from morning till night, working on this book of conversations, and then I'd go home and write it up and send it over. And of course, Paul didn't use a computer, so everything had to go by snail mail, as it were. So it took quite some time, and I have certainly accumulated a lot of paper, all those that manuscript going back and forth across the Atlantic several times before we were happy with it. It was quite a lot of work, but it was interesting and wonderful.
What about his writing did Paul feel was being misunderstood by the critics and maybe the broader readership?
Maybe not so much in the broader readership, but certainly by the critics. He felt that this tendency to categorize and to label, that he was often referred to as either a writer of detective fiction, New York Trilogy and some of those early books, and more than anything as a postmodern writer, and he didn't agree with that at all. I mean, for Paul, writing was a very serious business for him and had very much to do with finding ways in which he could put into words thoughts, emotions, experiences, things that really mattered to whichever character he is writing about at any given time. So that's what mattered to him, to find the right way to portray and to give voice to particular characters. And so for him, that's where the experimentation is, finding that way to convey with precision and accuracy his own thoughts and emotions. And so for him, it had nothing to do with postmodernism or post-structuralism or deconstruction or whatever label critics, would like to give him.
He
Um,
had great characters in books.
yeah.
They were colorful, they were idiosyncratic, perverse in some cases, but they're just great, colorful characters.
Yeah.
How did he define himself? Or, I mean, did he just say, look, I write literature, or I'm a fiction writer, and leave it at that?
I'm a writer. He was a writer. Yes. But I pressed him on it a couple of times, and he said, well, if anything, I'm an American writer. And that is true. I mean, most of the books, almost all of the books are set in America, and the characters are American, almost invariably. So it's American themes, it's American different political eras that he writes about. So if anything, I suppose that's true. He's an American writer,
Tell us
even if
about, oh, go ahead, Gita.
even if America has, was a bit late to recognize his talent and his wonderful, brilliant writing. I mean, he did become famous in Europe, long before the US. So.
Well, yeah, and supposedly, I mean, I remember reading the New York Times, uh,
Mm.
obituary, and they said he was, well known in America, well read in America, but a rock star in Paris. They loved him in France, in other parts of Europe. What do you think about Paul's writing appealed to the European ethos?
I think it's really rather intellectual, certainly in parts, and certainly, well, more so the early novels. Paul engages and challenges readers with some with ideas, and he read a lot of philosophy, certainly back then, and. Oh, I think that, and of course he worked in French. He translated French poetry. He was crazy about French poetry, and French was his second language. And he did spend time, quite a lot of time in France. So, and I think that whole mood back in the 1980s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when post-structuralism really hit the literary scene. Writers would draw quite a lot on intellect on theory. Not that Paul did so deliberately. It was just part of the whole. It's part of the way he thought about the world, and it's very much part of his writing. So I think that element of readerly challenge of French theory, if you will, that sort of is part of is runs sometimes like a subcurrent in his writing. I think that appealed to certainly the French, but he's a rock star in France, yes, but also in Spain and Germany and Denmark, and all of these countries really feel that they have a special relationship with Paul Auster, and they can't all have that. So, but that's what I come across, when I talk to people in these different countries, that we have a special relationship, or he has a special relationship with us. So there's a lot of that. Yeah.
Tell us about his personality. What was Paul like as a friend and a person?
Um, I mean, he was a very warm and generous person, certainly, and wonderful to work with and talk to. He was a very good listener. And if anything, you can see that also in the way in which he draws up the portraits of his characters as an awful lot of empathy. I mean, I teach Anglophone, contemporary Anglophone literature, and I've rarely come across a writer who is so good at, you know, showing empathy for his characters. So there's a lot of that. He's a good listener. He was a very generous, also very open. I mean, you could talk to Paul about anything really, and he would maybe not be interested, but he'd certainly listen. Even if he wasn't interested, he'd tell you. So.
What were his novels known for? I mean, I know he felt misunderstood by the critics, but there were many critics who valued his work, no question about it. What do you overall? What were his novels known for?
They are very different. Paul's novels are very different, but there's certain trends that recur throughout the body of writing from beginning to end. And in the book he and I did together, that book of conversations, we identified 11 recurrent themes. themes he would come back to again and again. So there was that element of familiarity for readers who'd read Auster, but I think the overall answer to the question about Paul's popularity, I think it's his ability to combine absolutely fabulous storytelling with that intellectual challenge I mentioned a moment ago. I mean, he was really able to combine to captivate his readers' attention, and then also tell us incredibly interesting stories. You yourself talked about his quirky characters, interesting characters with a lot of development, and then combined with, thinking, reflecting on their lives, on their relationships, on the big questions of life. So I think that was really interesting. He would often, in a book like 4321, he really became aware of the fact that what he tried to do often was to combine fable with everyday life. So you'd have these stories that take you off into different directions, sometimes into what you might call magic realism, or something which is out of the or really rather extraordinary, and telling these wonderful stories. I mean, everybody reads Auster. You can't pinpoint a particular kind of readership. His books are translated into 43 languages now, and people read him, irrespective across boundaries of class and gender and age, ethnicity, political persuasion, religion, what have you. He has so many different types of readers, so he appeals to
Yeah,
many.
I
Yep.
agree with you. The nature of his writing is such that it's a very open, it's very it's accessible to anybody. It's not the
Yeah.
sort of thing where it's really targeted for a certain segment of the reading public. And you
Mm.
never know where his stories are going. His characters, there would just certainly be turns along the way that would
Yeah.
take the characters and the main character, anyway, the protagonist, in a different direction. That was surprising. I mean, it was very, in fact, the Times Literary Supplement of Britain once called
Mm.
him one of America's most spectacularly inventive writers. He had a
Yeah.
great imagination. What was
Yeah.
his favorite novel? What was his, did he ever identify one of his novels that he said, this was my favorite, or where I think I reached the apex of my skill as a writer?
You know how many times he got that question? Everybody would ask him that question, and he would always say, "Well, it's like your children. You can't pick one above the others." So
Was
he
there
would.
one regarded as his masterpiece? I mean, by the critics or by you, that you would say this was his masterpiece?
I would argue that there are several, but the one book that where he really made his mark on the international scene, that was the New York trilogy. I mean, Paul Auster is associated with the New York trilogy, just like Lou Reed is associated with Walk on the Wild Side. And it would irritate him a little bit because he would feel, well, it was a great early book, but it's not his best writing. And of course, his writing also changed. I mean, in the early books, he would have these very short, precise, clear sentences. And then, if you mentioned Invisible, that's really after he'd done the films, things started to change in his writing, and the sentences became a lot longer. Um, and much more complex, culminating perhaps in 4321, where you have pages and pages of just one long sentence. So oh, I
Was
forgot.
that just an effect of his time and his skill improved, or did he just change his writing style because he was changing it for effect?
He wasn't changing it for effect. I think it was something that just happened. He,
Hmm.
you know, had these very short sentences. I don't know. He talked about it as something that just happened. started to happen with Invisible. Something else shifted in Invisible for him, and that was perspective. I mean, he started writing in the second person, from a second person perspective. He would have a you or address a you in Invisible, in parts of Invisible. And then the book that followed that, Sunset Park, there's much more of it. He things would change and he would develop simply. I think that's the answer to your questions.
It's a powerful technique writing in second person because, when you're using the you, the reader, you're really telling the reader that this is what you're experiencing. You enter the apartment. It was used to great effect by Jay McInerney a long time ago with Bright Lights, Big City. And not very many writers use the second person, but when it is used, and certainly could be overused, but it is powerful because in part, I think, as it's used so rarely, and secondly, because it really does engage the reader's own sense of, wow, I'm in the scene. This is me. What about what do you think his place in literary history is? That's a big question, Gita, but I'm curious whether how he'll be remembered. What will his place be?
I think it depends which canon we're talking about. Are we talking about Western Europe, the Western European canon? Are we talking about the European canon or the American canon? I mean, in Europe, certainly. I mean, Paul Auster is a star, and has already gone down in history and into the literary histories and anthologies. And I know in this country, in Denmark, he's taught at A level in schools. So, and France to Germany, Spain. I don't know about the US, but certainly a book like 4321, I mean, has been, some of the critics and theorists, one of them was Aliki van Vogel, another was Jim Peacock. They have all argued that this is going to be one of the great American novels. Just give it a bit of time. And of course, it is a book in which it is a big, complex book that gives a very fine portrait of a particular segment of urban life in the US from the 1950s to the 70s.
And it's a big book, right? I mean, it's 1,000 plus pages, maybe.
Yeah, yes, it is. It is. And a complex book, isn't it? I mean, it's one of these
multiple storylines.
Yeah, or parallel stories. And that's another thing that changed with Invisible through Sunset Park and into 4321. The perspective keeps changing, or you can have multiple perspectives on the same topic at the same time. These parallel storylines that are simultaneous are very interesting. And he takes that, of course, to an extreme in 4321.
In writing, coaches will tell you, oh no, you have to have a singular perspective. You can't have multiple perspectives, and that's nonsense. It's nonsense because when you tell people they can't do certain things, you're basically taking away a lot of their ability to innovate or to show real imagination or new forms of storytelling.
Yes.
He's not the only one who broke rules, but it worked for him. What were his obsessions? What did Paul obsess over, if anything, or what was his? Now, maybe obsession's not the right word, although Paul does strike me as a guy who could be obsessed about something, if not obsession. His chief interest. What did he have a great interest in or obsess over? Maybe other than the writing. I mean, obviously he was an obsessive writer, but other than that.
And he was a writer's writer, right? I mean, there's something about writing, the process of writing, in almost every novel. So that's one of the things if you want to call it an obsession, I don't know, but it's certainly something that propels his writing. Always, it is that meta, that self-reflective perspective writing about writing. But there are several recurring images in his writing. There's that teenage boy who was electrocuted by lightning, which something which really happened to Paul when he was a teenager away at summer camp, and the boy next to him, there was a thunderstorm, and they were crawling through a field trying to get back to camp and had to crawl under an electrical fence. And the boy next to him, the lightning hit and he was instantly killed. And that marked him so much. And that story comes back again and again in his writing. It's as if it's something he could never really let go of. So that's one certainly a recurring image in his writing. Also the that big question of what it is that makes us human. That's another thing that he keeps coming back to, probing the contours of that question again and again. That's why in the early work, Pinocchio was an important figure. And also in Mr. Vertigo, you have the Blue Fairy, and Pinocchio, of course, was all about becoming human, right? And so that, I think, is an important recurring theme, or red thread, if you will, running through his writing. And then, of course, writing itself. And then there are the 11 themes that he and I identified. Language and the body is one of them. Language, of course, is something, it is the writer's tools, isn't it? And something that Paul would think about always, the properties of language. How can we convey with precision and accuracy an emotion, a complex feeling, experience? How do we do that? How do we translate real life into words, as it were, or flesh and blood into paper and ink? That was something that he would always think about.
Did you have a favorite Paul Auster novel? Was there one in particular that was your favorite, Theda?
Well, I mean, I like Sunset Park a lot. I like all his books too, but Sunset Park is perhaps it is a favorite of mine. Because of those portraits that are so full of empathy. I mean, the characters he portrays there, you have these four young people who squat a house in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and they're all broken, they're all abandoned, they're all troubled in some way or other, and they become artists, each with a different art form, and they come together squatting this house, and the way in which they interact, and the way they are portrayed is really very, very wonderful. But Invisible, I think, is also a wonderful book. It's a very complex book, actually, especially that it's in 4 parts, and that 4th part is really rather strange. It sticks out, doesn't it? And is the other 3 are named after a season, I think, aren't they? In Invisible, and then you have that 4th act, as it were, that takes you in a completely different direction. A structure that he used also in that film called Smoke, where normally, you have 3, certainly in Hollywood film, or that's at least how Paul explained it to me. Hollywood film, you would have sort of, generally speaking, you would have 3 parts. And he did in Smoke, he did 3 parts, and then something quite different. The Christmas Story of Augie Wren that comes at the end in black and white. So that's another way of experimenting, another way in which he experimented with form, and certainly with traditional standard form.
Why is the Paul Auster Research Center housed at University of Copenhagen? I mean, he was big in Europe. It makes sense that something like that would be in Europe. How did it come to be at University of Copenhagen? Was that your doing, Gita?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Paul and I spent until 2016 on the book we wrote together, but our collaboration and certainly our friendship continued. So I would continue to come over, and I thought there's so much going on. There's so many readers interested in Auster, and so many critics also, so much academic work done now, one big monograph after another. So I thought we need an international hub for where we can have Auster scholarship. And so I set that up. And Paul helped me a lot. His agent, she wrote round to all the publishing houses around the world, and they kindly let me have their electronic manuscripts. So I have a big database with Auster's manuscripts in many different languages electronically, that we invite people to come and work across this body of work from different perspectives. So we set up, I set up this hub, and I have a wonderful core group of people, scholars from different universities who help me, and we have a lot of activities. You can find it online. We have a lot of activities. And the most recent development is that we are putting together a book on Auster's opening lines, first lines in Auster's prose, because they are so interesting, and it's something that he would also talk. It was very important to him to get that first line right, to set a tone, to give sort of have a certain music that would run through the book and capture the reader's attention. So we're putting together a book on that, and we're also I've inherited some of Auster's books, his private books, that I'm working with his wife now to bring over to Copenhagen, and we will have a nice place there with his books and some pictures and stuff where people can come and work.
Yes. So I'm always curious about people's writing routine, their work ethic. What do you know about how Paul wrote? Was he a morning writer? Was he an all-day writer, an evening writer, an everyday writer? What can you tell us about how he actually executed his craft?
He would write every day. I think every day, also during holidays and weekends, and he would, I think, get up in the morning and write until sort of a late lunch, every day.
And he didn't use a machine. He didn't use a laptop. He didn't use a desktop. What was it about that why no use of a word processor?
Well, I mean, if you asked him, his explanation was that it hurt his fingers. The keys would hurt his fingers, and I think that's rubbish. But that was his. He wanted to use the muscles of his fingers to tap the old-fashioned typewriter. You'd have to use a bit more strength. He felt more comfortable doing that, but in recent years he didn't type his manuscripts. He had a secretary. He would write with his fountain pen. Everything was in ink on paper in recent years. So,
and he preferred, okay. Yeah. So he liked to just write it, handwrite it. He felt a better connection that way, apparently.
Yeah.
I've heard other writers say that they feel like it's more of a connection to the brain when you're handwriting it and having it come right through the hand, right through the arm, the hand, the fingertips, and so on. But he did have, a vintage Olympia typewriter, which, but eventually he even gave that up. But as you say, the pounding on the keys and all, nothing like the sound of a manual typewriter. It's a beautiful sound. But with time, we went straight to writing. Just to get back to the Paul Auster Research Library and the Paul Auster Society are both under your purview, I believe. Yes. So. What about the Paul Auster Society? What can you tell us about that?
Well, we've only just started last year, and the same core group as with the Auster Research Centre. The idea is to have an international forum, not just for scholars, but readers of Auster across the world, and start in Copenhagen to have invite people in, not just writers or scholars or critics, but everyone, that has all types of professions that have to do with the book, the printer, the editor, the translator, the illustrator, and what have you, and the readers and the students too, to bring people who read books together to talk about Auster's writing, and then simply just to make sure we cement his legacy in the world. We're going to do some big conferences. We've done one already in the UK, with separate panels devoted to Auster's writing only.
Mm. Now, you mentioned Smoke. He got into cinema. He got into both writing screenplays and also directing. Now, in the case of Smoke, I guess he wrote the screenplay. He didn't direct it, I don't believe. But that was quite a hit in the United States. Not a huge hit. It was not that style of movie, but it certainly, at the least, it was a cult movie and had some big actors in it. Now,
Yes.
his writing is such that he gets you so deep into the story and the characters, which is not really possible with cinema because you have 90 to 120 minutes really to
Yeah.
tell your story. What was it about cinema that appealed to him?
He's always been crazy about film. If you read that memoir called Report from the Interior, he talks about the films from his earliest childhood, how important films have always been to him. He has just been, I suppose you might say, obsessed with modern film, and he made friends with Wim Wenders and many of these great filmmakers. It was Wayne Wang who directed Smoke. Paul wrote the screenplay for that, and the next film called A Blue in the Face, both starring Harvey Keitel and William Hurt, and as you said, great actors. He was just crazy about it. He took 5 years out away from writing to do film and loved it. And he was interested in, the image and the individual frames, where, it's visual, you can hear, you can see, it has color, it has movement. Whereas writing, of course, is just those black marks on the white page. For him, it was a completely different way of representing reality or a story. And he was very. I don't think all the films are equally successful. I must admit, I've never liked the Martin Frost film very much, but the other films, Smoke and Blue in the Face, I think are brilliant films.
Yeah, and I just did watch Inner Life of Martin Frost. Very again, very imaginative, outlandish in some ways. Not a great film, but it had that Paul Auster feel to it as well.
Yeah, yeah. But it comes out of that novel called The Book of Illusions, which was the first one he wrote after he stopped making films, which is about a film, which is about what was it called? Before the talkies, the films before
Silent films, silent films.
silent movie, yes.
Yeah.
So and in that book, in that novel, there is a story, as so often in Auster's writing, a story within a story within a story.
Mm.
And here's a story that is the inner life of Martin Frost, and Paul took that story and turned it into that film.
It's said that his career started to take flight in 1982 when he wrote a memoir called The Invention of Solitude. and it
Yeah.
was referred to as a haunting rumination on his distant relationship with his recently deceased father.
Mm.
That was one of didn't Paul write a few different memoirs?
He wrote 5 or 6 of them.
Five or six. Now,
Yeah.
was he writing these memoirs? Was that a form of self-exploration for Paul?
I mean, if you asked him, he would say that it was just the material that was very close at hand, and something he because it was his own story. Of course, they weren't autobiographies. It was just drawing on autobiographical material, and those two memoirs that came out in 2012 and 13, Report from the Interior and Winter Journal, they Winter Journal, Paul simply took the body, his own body, and the history of his own body, the wounds, the houses it had lived in, the food it loved, etc., etc. And in the next one, Report from the Interior, he looked at film and thoughts, how, his own evolution or development, intellectual development. Um, so he would just use that material because it was there and because it was interesting to him and because it would start speaking to him.
Yes, yeah. And then his first novel, anybody out there listening who is struggling right now to get published, Paul Auster's first novel, City of Glass, was rejected by 17 publishers before it finally got published by a small press in California. That was back in 1985. But as you said, Gita, the New York trilogy was the one that people point to a lot, kind of launched him in some ways. But he also was frustrated that people kept referencing that particular book when he felt like he had so many others that were
Yes.
either better than that or just worthy of attention.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But it is a mesmerizing book. I mean, you have three short novels, three, on the face of it, very different stories that sort of come together in the end. And a lot of mystery and of course it was early days for Auster as a prose writer. Of course, he started out as a poet and thought he was going to remain a poet for the rest of his life. And then his father died, and something happened to him, and he wrote that prose piece called White Spaces, I think on the night before his father died or the night after, and which is a beautiful piece of writing where you can see that shift in tone and in the music of his language from poetry into prose. And the first big work after his first big prose book is The Invention of Solitude, as you mentioned, which came out in 1982. Of course, it is in 2 parts too. The first part, as you quite rightly said, is about his father, the invisibility of his father, the way in which the father was always somehow mentally absent, and an attempt to sort of try and explain why. But the second part, the Book of Memory, is a fabulous and mesmerizing text of, I think, 13 little books that all deal with another kind of father for Auster. That is the literary precursors, those who had inspired him, right? Anything from Anne Frank to Hölderlin to Hawthorne and Thoreau, and I can't remember all of them here, but it's really a tribute to all those dead writers who meant a lot to him. So they were kind of parents, his literary parents, his precursors.
Mm-hmm. And
So
also, Robert, go ahead, finish that thought, Gita.
no, that's fine. I'm done.
Well, Robert Louis Stevenson was one of those authors. My understanding is that his mother had bought him a set of Robert Louis Stevenson books, and the thing that Paul saw in those books was these scintillating first sentences. And you were
Yeah,
talking earlier about how Paul really wanted to hone that first sentence. He wanted to set the tone or the mood that would
yeah,
be carried on throughout the book. And
yeah,
I always found that to be the case. That first sentence or that first paragraph or even the first page,
Yes.
he would be very engaging. He'd lock you in, and
Yeah.
then he'd take you on this exploration. You never knew where he was going to take you because he was so. And I suppose you could say that's true of anybody who writes, but Paul's imagination was really top flight. And
Yeah.
there's many writers out there who don't really display a lot of imagination. What it is it's genre writing. It's a detective novel or it's some kind of sci-fi thing or a
Yes.
political thriller that doesn't really require all that much imagination in many cases. His imagination, and he was very people centered.
Yes.
People who had strange ways about them, or
Yes.
ended up in strange engagements. And
Yeah.
that's the kind of, I mean, I'm certainly drawn to that kind of writing. Many people are drawn to that kind of writing, and I think that was part of his
Mm.
superpower as a writer, that he was so inventive in the way he created characters and then had those characters interact.
Yes. I absolutely agree. But you know, one of those, I mean, there's a lot of ambiguity in Auster's writing, isn't there? And that's and he realized that himself when he wrote the New York trilogy, or City of Glass, how important ambiguity is, and that element, you know, of never quite knowing where it's going, never quite knowing where the truth is, or what intention or meaning, things flying off in different directions all the time, was very important. And so I think that's part of it too.
Yeah, there was always kind of this, yeah, it's almost, there was always this mist. You know, he's
Yes.
kind of like you couldn't see too deeply into the forest. You always wondered what was really there. It was very engaging in that way as well. Now he wasn't without his critics, because there were people who considered his prose to be too simplistic. Just the actual use of words. Will Blythe, who worked with Esquire, said Auster played brilliantly throughout his career in the game of literary postmodernism, but with a
Mm.
simplicity of language that could have come out of a detective novel. And then in
Mm.
2017, the Vulture published an appraisal of his work with the headline "What Happened to Paul Auster?" A decade
Yes.
ago, he was a Nobel laureate, and
Mm.
it dismissed his novel as fodder for college age neophytes. There's
Mm.
another guy who said, wrote an article and said that Auster's work was a gateway drug to stronger stuff such as Beckett and DeLillo, or even
Mm.
Paul Auster's ex-wife, Lydia Davis.
Yes. Yes.
And when I said accessible, I mean, that is part of Paul's writing, is that it's very accessible. It's not complex in the sense of it's hard. You have to wrestle your way through sentences. The complexity in his novels has to do with the characters and the stories.
Yes.
What about was he aware of? I'm sure he was aware that people presented that criticism of his prose. Did he have any rejoinder to that?
No. No. He never, he would say, he would always say he never read reviews, and that's probably true. No, he was not fond of critics and reviewers, and he felt generally misunderstood. But I think it's also because for him, you know, he was, as he says in Sunset Park about one of the characters who's an actress, he says you know, you open your veins and bleed on the page. I mean, his material was very close to him and extremely important. It was his life. I mean, writing was everything. Um, so criticism, I think he didn't listen to it, and didn't take it very seriously.
Right, right. So he
Mm.
also took refuge in baseball, I understand, a lifelong passion.
Yeah.
I don't know how well you knew Paul's appetite for sports. Was he a Yankee fan or a Mets fan? Do you happen to know?
I think it was the Mets, wasn't it? I mean, there's baseball in all the books, almost all the novels. And these baseball stars. I can't remember. I'm not interested in baseball, so
I
I
know,
can't.
I know it's really an American sport, and it's not
Yeah.
not something that's really
Willie Mays. Who's Willie Mays? It's one of them. It's one of the ones he always
oh
talks about.
yeah, well yeah, New York Giants back before they moved to San Francisco. There was the New York Giants, and that when Willie Mays played for the New York Giants and the San Francisco Giants.
He's one
Um,
of his heroes, Willie Mays. Yeah, but there were
what
many.
about
Hmm?
what were you in touch with Paul when he was suffering from cancer?
Yes, yes, yes.
What how did he yeah, and I don't want to get too deep into this, but I'm just
Mhm.
curious, how did he um, regard? I mean, he was facing his mortality. We all do, but I mean, it was right in his face at that point. I don't know whether he believed in the metaphysical. He certainly wrote like he believed in the metaphysical, but did he believe in the metaphysical? Was he accepting of what was going on? Can you tell us anything about how the end of life, how things were going for him emotionally towards the end of life?
Oh, he was devastated. I mean, he would say to me several times, I don't want to go. It was too soon for him and too sudden also. But at the same time, he accepted it, and he had tremendous strength. I mean, he wouldn't complain. He was in enormous pain. I mean, it wasn't just the cancer of the lungs, and but it was also fractured spines, and he was in a lot of pain. But he wouldn't complain, and he really did his best not to. I mean, simply just to make it all right for people close to him, his wife and his daughter and family and friends. So it was a very dignified way of leaving this world. But he didn't want to go, certainly didn't. He felt though that he had, he'd written the books he wanted to read to write. So it wasn't that. It was just, it was too soon, too sudden for him.
He was what, 77, I believe, when he
Yeah,
died. And,
yeah.
it reminds me of when John Updike suddenly got cancer and
Mm,
he had so much more he wanted to write. He had projects that were underway, he had projects that were planned, suddenly
yeah,
comes down with cancer and it all comes to an end. And it just kind of echoes with Paul. So
yeah,
much great writing that he left behind, so many great stories he left behind.
yeah,
But it's Patti Smith who musician, but also a winner of the National Book Award for Just Kids, her novel about herself and Robert Mapplethorpe, who says um, part of the how did she put it? She said, "For the privilege of living this life, there comes a time when you have to leave."
yeah,
And nobody wants to leave, especially when they're still replete. There's
yeah,
still Paul still had so much more. He still
yes,
had energy. He still had ambition. He still wanted to do things, and nobody wants to leave under those circumstances.
yeah, yeah. No, that's true. That's true. He used to say that he found it very strange that his characters would outlive him. Um,
Isn't that is strange, but also a great thing that he's got that legacy. He's leaving a tremendous legacy behind as well.
yeah.
Um, Gita, thank you so much for taking the time and speaking with us. Again, what a great thing it is that you got to spend so much time with the great Paul Auster. I really appreciate the time. Thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you. Thank you.